The only things you're going to need to start this project are some big chunky yarn. And what you're looking for when you're finding that yarn is something that has this 7 jumbo weighted yarn. So there's Loops and Threads Fluffy Chenille. There's also some Cozy Blanket. There's some Bernat Blanket Big. All of these are good 7s that would give you a really nice fluffy chunky blanket. You're also going to need a pair of scissors. That's all that you need to get started, and preferably working on some kind of flat tabletop. So when you're getting started, you have a skein of yarn, and then you have the end of it that's called the tail. And the part of the yarn that goes towards the skein is called the working yarn. So the first thing you're going to do in any of the hand knitting projects is you're going to want to do a slip knot. So there's lots of ways to do a slip knot, but one way is to put your fingers facing yourself and then wrap or drape the yarn over your fingers so that the tail is on the right hand side and the working yarn is on the left hand side. And then I'm going to take my left hand and I'm going to hold both the tail and the working yarn, and I'm forming a loop right there with my fingers. And the goal of this is to twist your hand around in order to get this yarn to cross on top of this yarn. So what I'm doing is I'm moving my hand away from me. So I'm moving counterclockwise and moving my fingers away from me, and that's causing this yarn to cross on top of the bottom yarn, on top of the tail. And now that I have this, I'm going to take some pincher fingers and I'm going to grab the working yarn. Remember that the working yarn is the one that's attached to the skein, not the tail. Notice how I'm still holding on to the tail over here with my other hand. And then I'm going to pull some of this working yarn through, and that is going to create for us something called a slip knot. And a slip knot slips up and down the working yarn to be able to give you different size loops. And that is your slip knot. Now the key to your hand knitting projects are these knit stitches, and you want these stitches to be nice and even, or as best you can do. So in order to do that, first we're going to create a chain stitch on the base, and then we're going to start building up these different rows using knit stitches, and then at the end we're going to follow back through with one final stitch to kind of wrap everything up. To begin this next section of chain stitching, you're going to take your slip knot and you're going to slip the knot so that this first loop is about 3 or 4 fingers, depending on how wide you want your stitches to be. So if I make this slip knot and I'm able to fit the 3 fingers through, then each of the next chain stitches that I make, I'm going to try and keep measuring and try and keep them about that same amount. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your pincher fingers through this loop. You're going to grab some of the working yarn and you're going to pull it through, creating a new loop. Then you're going to go into that new loop with the same 3 fingers, grab some working yarn and pull it through. Go through, grab some working yarn, pull it through, grab some working yarn, pull it through. And the amount that you're pulling it through, if you pull it too much, way more than the 3 fingers, you can kind of take the working yarn and pull it back so that you can keep that even. And you're going to try and make as many even stitches as you can. And this is going to be the width of your blanket. So I'm going to go ahead and make a chain of 30 for the width of my blanket. I think anything over 20 or 25 would make a nice width for a blanket. 20 might be right at like a large beach towel in width. And then if you go a little bit further, depending on your yarn and depending on your stitches, you can end up with something a lot wider and nicer to lay over your lap. I've just completed my 30 chain stitches, and just as kind of a reference point for you, everybody's stitches in everybody's yarn may be a little bit different, so this might be a little off depending on what kind of yarn or how big or how tight your stitches are. But my 30 stitches take up about 36 inches, which is 3 feet. So right now, without even doing any stretching of my basic chain, my blanket is already going to be at least 3 feet wide. And so that's a good width for me to go ahead and continue. So with this chain of 30 as my base of my blanket, I'm about to start building up the rows to make the length of my blanket. And so right now I have this last loop that I left off with my chain stitching, and I have my working yarn, which is going towards my skein. And so you'll notice right now that the working yarn is going down towards the table. So if your working yarn is going down towards the table, I need you to flip it over so that the working yarn is coming up towards you. Or if your working yarn is already like this coming up, you don't need to do any flipping. So we're about to put our very first stitch in, and with this last loop right here, we're going to leave that loop alone. We're not going to include that one in our base row going in this direction, but we are going to come back and grab it. So in order to make this first thing, what you're going to do is, you see at the top of each of these stitches is kind of this like layover pattern. These are the top stitches of your blanket. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into each one of these and we're going to add a loop. And so that's how we're going to create the length of our blanket. So I have my working yarn, and I like to keep my working yarn lined up in the direction of the chains that I'm about to go. And what I'm going to do is, with the working yarn coming up towards me, I'm going to take my 3 pincher fingers through this very first loop right here. I'm leaving this one alone on the side. I'm going to take my pincher fingers and I'm going to grab a bit of that working yarn, and I'm going to pull that working yarn up and lay it over. Then I'm going to go through this next part right here with the same 3 pincher fingers, and I'm going to pull that amount of working yarn up and over. So right now I have this one that I didn't put anything through. I pulled a loop through here. I pulled a loop through here. This is the next spot I'm going to pull a loop through. So I take my 3 pincher fingers, and by kind of keeping it on a flat table, what I'm doing right now is I'm kind of able to visually make sure that these loops are about the same size, which is going to keep my stitches nice and even. So I'm going to go through all the way across this chain, and I'm going to be pulling up loops that are the same height through each one of these kind of curved parts on the top of the stitch from the chain stitch row. And I'm going to pull a loop through each one of those and go all the way across my 30 stitches. So when you've reached the end of your 30 stitches, you technically have 31 loops because you have that original loop hanging out on the side too, but you've pulled up 30 stitches and you have this original 31st loop. And then I'm about to start the next row. So I like to line up my skein furthest away from me, like at the top of my table. And then I like to have the working yarn in a line in the direction I'm about to go, kind of leading the way like a guide wire. And then what's going to happen next is you're going to go through each one of these loops and you're going to pull a new stitch through each one of these in the same way that we just did. So what I want to caution you about right here is we're not going to skip the first one like we did. We're not going to do that ever again. It's just on that bottom base row. But we're going to take our pincher fingers and we're going to grab some of this yarn and we're going to pull that same amount that we were doing up through and lay it down over. So go through each one of these loops now and grab that yarn. And you can tell that right now I'm not using all 3 of my pinchers because I've kind of gotten the idea of how big I want that loop to be. But you're always welcome to go back and measure by checking, making sure that each of those loops you're pulling is about the same size using your pincher fingers. So I'm going to pull loops, and like I said, I'm kind of just using my fingers because it is a little bit faster rather than using my pinchers. But you can keep double checking that you're keeping your stitches nice and even as you go. And you're just going to keep pulling one loop up through each one of these loops that you already have. Now I'm about to finish off this row going in this direction. And so I still have to pull a loop through here. And then remember that on our very first row, we have this extra, which kind of looks like a thumb hanging out down here. So at this point, you do want to go ahead and put a loop through that one. And that's going to pull this row together and pull this all up and make a nice side line for you. So we've just completed the row going in this direction, and now I'm going to line up my working yarn, sorry. And I'm going to line up my working yarn in the direction that I'm going to go this time. And from now on, we're not skipping this first stitch, but something I do want to caution you to is if this happens to get stuck under something and you just pull up a loop, see how you've left something really big and dangly over here? You don't want that to happen. So even with this first stitch, you want the working yarn to almost go underneath your loops so that what you're pulling up is the correct length for that stitch that you want to pull up there. So I've made progress on several rows of my blanket, and I have officially run out of my skein of yarn. So if I wanted to continue with exactly the same color, all you would do is go ahead and make a square knot and pull it tight, but be careful because this yarn can snap, and pull it tight on both sides. And then honestly, that's all you have to do. And then I would go ahead and cut down each of these ends and see how that knot just really blends into the chunky yarn. So what's great about the chunky yarn is that there's room for forgiveness. So you can't really even tell that that knot is there. And when you are doing your stitches, just be careful because the knot might accidentally get stuck under something. So make sure that when you pull a loop through that has the knot in it, just be careful with that. And then you just continue to keep going with that same color. Now, if you didn't want to attach the same color, you probably don't want to change colors of your skeins. I'm going to cut this off and show you the other option. So if you run out of yarn or your skein is empty and you're still in the middle of a row, then you probably don't want to change colors right there. So what I recommend is going ahead and gently pulling out what you were able to do with that yarn. And don't necessarily throw this away because we can tie it on to the next skein, like the color part I just showed you with the next time we use that color. But you're going to go back to the place where you were about to start the row but didn't have enough yarn to be able to completely finish that. And then you can go ahead and cut this down. And just as a reference, again, I'm using the Bernat Blanket Big, and this is 32 yards. So I was able to use 30 stitches and get a pretty decent height so far, almost about 8 or 10 inches with one skein. So you can imagine that if I have 4 or 5 skeins, I'm gonna have a really nice size blanket. So I'm gonna go ahead with this next color, and I'm gonna try and find the center pool. There it is. And I'm gonna trim this down. That's probably about 3 inches of a tail. And I'm gonna use this yarn, and I'm gonna do the same thing I did with the same color, where I'm just gonna go ahead and make a square knot. And I'm gonna make it pretty tight and pretty close to where I left off. And once I have that pretty secure and pretty tight, I can cut down, trim down the ends, and then it's a lot closer to the exact same size of the normal chunky yarn. So then when I'm about to start this next row, I'm gonna do exactly the same thing as what I've been doing. I'm lining up my working yarn. I'm gonna pull my first loop carefully through, keeping in mind that that knot might get stuck on something, so be careful. And then I'm going to continue to pull up loops using the new color. So this is a really nice transition between colors. The colors aren't dramatically different. It's kind of a nice ombre effect with the color choices, the 2 different pinks that I selected for this time. But I do want you to see on the other side that there will be a line in your purl stitches, and that's totally normal. That's what happens when you change. So on your knit stitch side, this is technically your good side. You're not going to be able to see a funky transition. It's going to be a nice smooth transition of color right here, but that will show up as a line on your purl side, just so that you know. And I'm going to continue to go with this nice light pink, and I'm going to continue to build length of my blanket. I've completed several rows of this next color, and I'm now ready. I know that I don't have enough working yarn to go all the way across and do another row. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of this row, and I'm going to cut a tail of probably about 3 inches. And then I'm going to take the new color and I'm going to tie a square knot with that new color. And I'm going to pull this carefully but tightly, because this will snap if you put too much pressure on it. I'm going to keep going and working that as get a nice tight knot. And then I go back with my scissors and kind of trim down the two sides to get what looks like a pretty similar texture going across, or thickness of the yarn. And then I'm ready to go ahead and change colors and keep going in this direction. And just to kind of show you again what happens, on the purl side you have a little bit of the color transition, but on the knit side it's a really nice smooth transition. So I'm going to use this new color and I'm just going to continue to pull up loops and continue to build the length until I'm satisfied. So I'm on my third skein right now. This whole entire project will probably take you about 3 hours to complete, but then you'll have a really nice big blanket, fluffy, cozy, and it's great to give gifts. It's great to just have on your couch, have a couple of them on your couch, so when company comes over, everybody can stay nice and cozy. So I'm at the end of this row, and again, just to start each next row, you're going to line up your working yarn, going parallel and going in the direction of which you're going to be making your next stitches, and just pulling those loops up and continuing to build each one of those rows. You'll also notice that you start to build up blanket down here. You can choose to roll this up, or if you are working on a nice table surface, you can kind of just let it flow off the table and kind of keep giving yourself more space up here to keep working. So just kind of letting that blanket flow off the table, or if you don't have a lot of space like that, you can always roll up the bottom portion that you're building towards yourself, and then you can kind of keep giving yourself some more space to be able to continue to keep pulling these loops. And that's really what you just keep doing this entire blanket. So once you learn this basic knit stitch, you can make something really beautiful and have a good time doing it. So I'm coming to the end of this last skein, and this is the last skein of my whole blanket. I've used 4 skeins for mine. So this is how you're going to finish it up. Now you might remember that I said that as you were going, your blanket might start to fan out. This is the place where we're going to kind of wrap it back in, and it's all going to kind of line back up. So in order to finish off this blanket, we are going to do something a little different this row, where we're going to pull the loops double the length of the loops you have been pulling. So instead of just a normal pull like what we've been doing, you're going to do double what you've done. So just pull those up and lay those down and go all the way across your blanket with double the length loops. And we're going to need that double length in order to kind of stitch all the way across to have a really nice top finishing stitch. So go ahead and pull all of those double loops all the way across the width of your blanket. And if you're satisfied with the length, then this is the time for you to do the double loops. If you're not quite satisfied with the length, you can always add another skein. The length can keep continuing to get larger, but the width is always going to stay the same depending on what size chain you started with. So I'm going to pull up all these double loops, and then I'll show you how we're going to go across and finish. Okay, so I've just finished pulling all the double length loops across the top, and I am at the end of my skein. So because this is where it ended, in order to begin the top stitch, we're going to go to the other side in order to end the complete blanket where this tail ends. So I'm coming to the other side. Depending on where my blanket ends, you go to the opposite side with all the double-sized loops, and here's how you're going to finish the top of this blanket. You're going to take your pincher fingers and you're going to go through this final loop, and with your pincher fingers you're going to grab the loop next to it, and then you're going to put your fingers into the new loop, and you're going to grab the loop next to it. You're going to put your fingers in that one and grab. So it's like you're switching. Fingers through, grab, switch, fingers through, grab, switch, and you're going to continue to do this across the top of your blanket. And you'll notice that it's giving you a really nice finished top to the blanket. So the reason why we did these double length loops at the very end was so that it gives us enough to pull it through and lay it down over to give you that nice stitch that lays over top of all of your other stitches. So you're grabbing, switch, put your fingers through, grab, switch, and continue all the way across the width of your blanket, grabbing and switching all the way across. And I'm almost to the end, and then there's one last bit at the end before you complete your entire blanket. So I love this finishing stitch. It gives it a real nice edge. And I'm just grabbing and switching and grabbing and switching. And here's my last loop, and I grab. And then, because this is where the tail is, this is where we end it, the tail is gonna go through, so your pinchers can grab the tail, and you're gonna pull this nice and tight. And then you're probably gonna wanna take your tail and loop it through another place and just make another knot, just for safety, maybe even one more for good measure. So I'm just pulling up another random stitch and kind of doing a square knot or half a square knot through that. And then at this point, you can either decide to weave the end in. And what I mean by weaving the end in is if you've ever crocheted or knitted, when you have these extra tails, you can kind of go back and put them through some of your other stitches in order to hide them. Or at the end, as long as you have this nice and secure right here, you can go ahead and do what we've been doing with the rest of our ending of yarn and beginning of the next skein by just trimming it down. You will also have a tail at the beginning of your blanket, and so you might want to just put that through one more time somewhere as well, just to make sure that it's nice and secure. And when I pull this through and make a nice knot, I busted it myself, and then I can go ahead and trim this down also. And all my tails are now hidden, and I have an absolutely gorgeous blanket. And I used 30 stitches going across and 4 skeins, and have a really nice size lap throw blanket. You can continue if you want it to be even longer. So that is your 3-hour hand knit blanket.